In today's recipe we are focusing on making bread. We're looking at a bloomer loaf to make, which is one that we can be baked on a baking tray, so you don't need the bread tin for this recipe. We're looking primarily at the function of flour in the bread making, but we will be looking at some raising agent functions as well. We are focusing on the carbohydrate ingredients at the moment. So we have strong bread flour that has a high gluten content, which is going to help with the structure of the dough and allow the elasticity and the rise on that dough. I will go into that into some detail when we get to the kneading process. We've also got oil that extends the shelf life. It keeps the bread fresher for longer. It also helps with colour and flavour as well. We have sugar. Sugar will be feeding the yeast, so that will be a little bit of energy for the yeast to help it to activate and breathe, as well as the moisture in the water and the warmth in the water. So to activate the yeast, it needs certain conditions, water being one of them, warmth being another. The water also is going to bind all the ingredients together today and work as a little bit of a glue for us. I also have salt. Salt is there as a stabiliser. Obviously it adds flavour too, but it just controls the yeast so that the yeast is breathing the carbon dioxide, but it's breathing it and keeping it stable so it doesn't go too crazy, doesn't end up with big pockets of the carbon dioxide. So this is a stabiliser. We do need to keep them separately. I'll explain that as I'm adding in the ingredients. And then we have the yeast. So you can buy the dried yeast, you can buy fresh yeast as well. It's a little bit more difficult to get hold of, but this is a microorganism. So this is a live product that needs those conditions to be able to wake up, to activate, and then to breathe, as I've mentioned before, carbon dioxide. So this is our raising agent today that's going to help rise that bread. So first thing we're going to do is I'm going to sieve the flour into the bowl. This just takes out any of the lumps, adds a little bit of air into there. So not only have we got the raising agent in the yeast, which is a microbiological raising agent, but we've also got air being transferred into that flour as well through those particles, which will help the bread to rise. So once the flour is in, we're going to add the salt to one side, and I'm going to add the yeast to the other side. So just using a sachet of the yeast. We're keeping those separately. As I mentioned before, we need to keep them separately. But so that you know why, salt is hygroscopic. Hygroscopic means it likes to take water, it likes to absorb water from things. So if we put them together, the water that the yeast needs will then obviously be taken out by the salt. So we do keep them separate so they're not touching. We're then going to add in the oil. We're going to make a well in the centre, so that's a hole in the middle of the flour. We're going to add in the oil, and we're going to add in the sugar, which is the food for the yeast. We're going to stir all those around, and then we have the water. Now, depending on how absorbent your flour is, which you can't tell from a packet, you may not need all of your water, so you do have to judge this very much with your eyes and with your hands. So we're adding in about 2/3 of the water to start with, to really start to bring it together. And then we're going to gradually add some more water as we need it until all of the flour has been absorbed. So popping that in. Now that, as I said before, is warm water. That is to help to activate the yeast. So we want it nice and warm so that it wakes up that yeast, so that that yeast can start to breathe when we get to the proving process. So bringing it together with my hands, you'll notice I'm not using a spoon today. It gets stuck on the spoon, it gets stuck on your hands, so you may as well save yourself some washing up and just use your hands. It's a lot better if you're using your hands with regards to judgment as well. You get a real feel of the way that the dough should be. It should be slightly sticky and soft. By adding too much flour, if you want to put all your water in at once to make it really soggy and then add more flour, you are ruining the balance, you are drying out the product, and then you'll get a dense, hard dough. So I have now brought this together in a dough in the centre, but you can see I've still got flour around the outside. So I'm just going to continue adding small amounts of the water until it absorbs all of that flour, and I should have a soft, sticky dough in my hands, which I'm nearly there with now. A little bit more water, and then we'll be able to handle this and get it on the work surface, and I can show you the next stage, which involves the gluten. So carbohydrates, obviously in many different forms, but a lot of the basis of flour. So Pasta is obviously made with flour, as is bread, and carbohydrates are there as an energy source for us so that we can get through the day. So our body really needs that energy, and carbohydrates are a good source of it. Obviously, if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates in your diet and you're not exercising, then we can then start to convert those carbohydrates, and that's when we can become overweight. So we need to just be careful of how many carbohydrates we are eating, but obviously as balanced diet, as long as you're following a balanced diet, then carbohydrate source at each of your meals in the day should be sufficient. So we now have a dough, slightly sticky still, you can see by my hands, but this is ready to go on the work surface. Now, a lot of people put flour on the work surface. The problem with flour is it can dry out the dough quite a lot. So what we want to do is keep this nice and soft. So one thing to do as an alternative to flour, gets a little bit slimy, but you can add some oil to the work surface. So just a drizzle of oil on your work surface. Throwing the lid around the place. And then we can just start to manipulate and handle that bread dough with the oil. Now, we need to do this next process for 5 to 10 minutes. So I will not be standing here for 5 to 10 minutes kneading this. I will just show you how to start it off, and then obviously I'll come back to it when the kneading process is finished. Look, we knead with the heel of our hands, so the bottom of the palm of our hands, and we are pushing down and away from ourselves with the dough, folding over, pushing away. Fold over, push away, and we want to keep this motion up. And the idea is that we will knead this for long enough that it will be able to stretch for approximately 20 centimetres without breaking. So we want to bring that elasticity into the dough by stretching the gluten. Now, one way to think about it is that gluten is lots and lots of elastic bands. And elastic bands, when you first get them, are quite tight, quite restrictive. So the more you stretch them, a little bit like a hair bubble maybe as well, the more you stretch that elastic, the more flexible it comes and the longer that it will go. That is what we're trying to do inside this bread dough. So we've got to imagine lots and lots of pieces of elastic in here. And the more we do this and knead them, and the more that we stretch, it becomes more flexible. So it's more elasticated, and then it will give a bigger rise. So as those yeast particles are waking up, as they're activating, they will start to breathe the carbon dioxide. Now, if they're breathing carbon dioxide in a very restricted area, there's only so far that they can go. Whereas if we have kneaded it and we've allowed that flexibility and we've stretched that gluten, the bread dough has got more room to rise, and that's when you get a really good rise on your bread. So we're going to keep doing this for about 10 minutes, and what you'll find is the more we do it, the smoother the dough will come. So as you can see at the moment, it's quite claggy, it's quite slimy. What you'll notice when I've finished mine is a much smoother, flexible dough that hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that it can stretch about 15 to 20 centimetres. So I'm just going to keep kneading, and I'll come back to you after the 10 minutes. Now that I've kneaded the dough for approximately 10 minutes, you can now see a much smoother texture to the dough. And if I stretch it, it stretches probably going on for 30 centimetres before you can see it's starting just to tear there. So you want this really soft, manageable dough. If the dough is really, really hard, the rise is going to be low because you've added too much flour, so it's too dense. There's not enough air in that product, and there's not enough moisture. Now that we have kneaded, we have stretched that gluten, we've given that elasticity, we're allowing that space for the yeast to now activate and breathe. We need to just leave it. Lukewarm area is perfect, so just room temperature. Yes, we all would love a proving drawer, or at least I would, but it isn't necessary. Just a warm room in the house. Don't leave it in direct sunlight because it will start to crust on the top. Just in a warm area for, ideally, which is why we don't get the best rise when we are doing these in school, but ideally about 1.5 hours up to 3 hours would be absolutely perfect. And what we should see is that this will double in size at least. And that's all of the yeast has activated, creating those air pockets of carbon dioxide inside this bread to give us a really good rise. So to do that and keep it nice and safe so nothing lands on it, we're going to add just a little bit of oil into our bowl. So I've just cleaned my mixing bowl. And we're just going to add a little bit of the oil just around so that the bread doesn't stick to the dish as it starts to rise. And we are going to pop the dough, which is now lovely and smooth, into the bottom of here and cover it with cling film. And we will leave that yeast to activate, like I say, for 1.5 to 3 hours. So that will now stay here. I'm just going to leave this on top of my cooker. It's not on at all, it's just a nice warm area, but it's away from direct sunlight. So I'll come back to you in a few hours and we'll show you the next stages in making the bread dough. Three hours has now passed since I left the bread dough to prove. As you can see, probably trebled in size, I would say, rather than doubled. So this bread dough now, we need to do something called knocking back. So we're going to knock the air out of it that has been fermenting, and then we're going to shape it before we do a second prove and bake the bread. So first of all, pull the bread dough out. Lightly floured work surface. Obviously this is now a really soft dough, so a very light scattering of flour just so it doesn't stick to the work surface. And knocking back is literally just kneading it a couple of times just to get it to its original shape. Now, to shape it to a bloomer so that we can do that free rise without having a baking or bread tin, we are going to try and fold it into the shape of a rectangle. We're going to roll it into the shape of a rectangle, I should say. And we want to do it as though it's a portrait piece of paper. So it's, as we look at it, we're looking as though it's portrait, not landscape. So I want a quick roll. Obviously, because of that gluten, when you roll it out wide, it will automatically contract and start to pull. So we do need to roll it a few times just to get it into that A4 slight shape piece. And once we've got it into that, making sure we turn it over a couple of times. If you roll it out the whole time without turning it, you often find it stuck to the work surface. You have to kind of start again. So making sure you're moving it all the time and rolling it so that it gets... As you can see, I've now achieved a rectangular shape with the bread. I'm doing this on a close-up for you so you can see exactly how this works. So I've got the landscape towards me. What I'm doing is getting the top and folding to the centre. So I've still got this bottom part. Then with the bottom part, I'm going to go over so that I've created a little bit of a sandwich. We're going to turn it over and we're going to tuck the ends under so that we get a bloomer type shape like so. And then all we're doing is just trying to manipulate that shape a little bit with our hands so that we don't have the creases, we can't see the folds, and those edges are really tucked under. And then what I'm going to do is add this now to a lightly floured baking tray, pop that on here, and we're going to leave that again to prove now for half an hour, an hour. I will be covering this, but you want to try and cover it without touching the bread dough so it doesn't get stuck. So if you've got one of the food protectors to go over the top, that's perfect, or a plastic bag, but you need to make sure there's air in the plastic bag so that it's like a dome. But I'm going to leave that now for half an hour to an hour before doing the final cuts into the bread and popping it in the oven. Now that the bloomer bread has had another half an hour to prove, you can see again that it's started to rise. So all of the fermentation with the yeast, it's activated, it's breathing that carbon dioxide. That has now created that rise. With the second one, we don't want to knock it back. We want to really retain all of that carbon dioxide that's in there to help the bread with its rise, with its overall texture. So very, very carefully now, we're just going to splash it with some water, and then we're going to sprinkle it with flour just to help with that crust. We're just going to sprinkle it with a little bit of flour and just pat it down and rub that in. As you can see, I'm doing this very gently so that I don't knock away the rise on the bread. Now, finally, we're going to give that traditional bloomer look, we're going to add some slices on a diagonal on the top. If I didn't do this, as it rises, it would continue to rise, and it would actually form its own cracks, which would be quite uneven and generally go along the side, and they'll actually open up the bread. This will give it the distinctive look, but also a better quality finish. So you're just going to, with a sharp knife, just slice through to open up that bread in 4 different areas. Again, very, very gently, try not to press on it so that we knock away all of that carbon dioxide. You just want to make sure that you've kind of pierced the skin of the bread dough on each of those. Now this is ready to go into the oven. Now I'm just going to change the camera angle to show you going into the oven, just because there is something else that will help with the steam of this, help with the rise and help to form a crust, which I'm going to explain. As you can see, please don't judge the inside of my oven, there is a roasting tin in the bottom. What I'm going to do now is pour water into this roasting tin very, very carefully with oven gloves. That's called a bain-marie, and that is going to create steam within the oven. So as the bread rises, it will help to form that lovely crust that you get from a bloomer loaf. So as I pour this in, I'm going to do it very, very carefully, pulling the roasting tin out. So the roasting tin is already hot. I'm going to pour about half a litre of water into there, and that will begin to steam as the bread goes in. So now I'm going to pop the bloomer, as you can see with the slices, into the oven, and it's in there on 220 for about 25 minutes, and then we'll reduce the temperature down to about 200 degrees, gas mark 6, for the last 10 to 15 minutes to give it a really good colour. So now that the bread has baked, has been removed from the oven, the best way to test whether it is cooked all the way through and there's no more dense raw dough is to see whether it sounds hollow. So we hold up the bread and we tap like a drum, and you should hear that hollow sound. If it still sounds quite dense, obviously that means that some of the bread dough is still not cooked all the way through, so we need to pop it back into the oven on that lower heat just to cook it a little bit more. Okay, so now nice and hollow and ready to be cut up.